name's Zoe Harcombe and I'm author of The Harcombe Diet. Today we're going to do a short video on saturated fat. This is a very serious video because saturated fat has had incredibly bad press over the last few years, and indeed we're told to avoid saturated fat like the plague. And this video is about giving a voice back to saturated fat and saying most of the time when we're talking about saturated fat we don't even know our macronutrients from each other, and all will be explained. People who are familiar with the Harcombe Diet will know that there are basically only three things that we can put into our body. These three things together are called macronutrients, and the three macronutrients are fats, carbohydrates and protein. Those are the only things that we put into our body at the macronutrient level. Now again, people familiar with the Harcombe Diet will know that protein is in everything, pretty much everything anyway, other than a couple of unusual foods like sugar, arguably possibly shouldn't even be a food, but protein is in everything. So we tend to look at foods as either a fat stroke protein or a carb stroke protein, and then we just drop the word protein because it's in everything. So when we're talking about fats, we're essentially talking about things that are not carbohydrates, and that distinction is so important. Now in the UK we have two primary sources of advice on the issue of saturated fat, and they are the Food Standards Agency and the National Health Service. And they each have a table on their website talking about what actually is saturated fat, and thankfully there is remarkable consistency between the two things. I will put all of this on my website so you can go and see it for yourself. But they describe sources of saturated fat as fatty cuts of meat, butter, cream and other dairy products, and they include ice cream in that, we'll come back to that one, pastries, cakes, biscuits, some savoury snacks, some sweet snacks and chocolate, and coconut oil. Well, we hardly eat any coconut oil in the UK. I understand that they eat about 120 coconuts per person per year over in Sri Lanka, and they actually have about 1,000th of the deaths of heart disease that they do in many other countries. So there might be a connection there, but I certainly don't think that coconuts are bad for us. Let's just look at some of those again, because remembering that things are either primarily carbohydrate stroke protein or fat stroke protein, I don't know if you spotted, but a huge number of products on that list are actually primarily carbohydrates, and they are processed foods. They would be foods that we would automatically avoid on the Harcombe Diet. So ice cream, pastries, cakes, biscuits, savoury snacks, sweet snacks, chocolate, all primarily carbohydrates, and yet they are being described here as primarily saturated fats, and that is fundamentally wrong. So that's the first thing that we have got very, very wrong. When we need to accuse saturated fat of all these dreadful crimes that we quite wrongly accuse it of, let's at least talk about saturated fat when we are trying to hang it for these various crimes. Now here's where it gets very interestingly. Here's a savoury snack, excuse the rustling, and this is, as I've said, predominantly carbohydrate. In this 100 gram bag here of savoury snacks, cheesy savoury snacks, 50 grams is carbohydrate, so half of this product is carbohydrate. There are 30.8 grams of fat, and wait for this, only 12 of those 30.8 grams are saturated fat. The primary fat in this heap of, quite frankly, load of junk is actually monounsaturated fat. And isn't that the stuff that at the same time the government is telling us to eat more of? So the government is primarily saying base your meals on starchy foods and eat more monounsaturated fat. Well, that's 50% starchy food, and the majority of the fat in it is this monounsaturated that you're telling me to eat. So surely I'm being given advice here to eat something as ridiculous and unhealthy as a carbohydrate processed snack. The ingredients, if you're interested, are things like wheat flour, yeast autolysate, whatever on earth that is, sugar, glucose syrup, malted barley this, bicarbonate that. It really is a heap of junk that you shouldn't be putting in your body. But every other example of the cakes, pastries, biscuits, the other things that I looked at were also predominantly carbohydrate, and in 9 times out of 10 the primary fat in those products was this monounsaturated fat that the government is trying to tell us is good for us. Followers of the Harcombe Diet will know that I basically think there are two food groups. There are food as is delivered by nature, in the form that nature intends us to eat it, and that is good. And there is food delivered by food manufacturers in the form that food manufacturers want us to eat it, and that is bad. And those are the only two food categories that you need to know about. And on that basis, any food that has fat in it is with a good fat, it's a healthy fat, whether it's saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. If it's found in a real food, it is good fat. Now in this egg, we have saturated fat, we have monounsaturated fat, we have polyunsaturated fat, we have essential fatty acids, we have the whole range. And nature does indeed tend to put all the fats in all of its real products. It may interest you to know that the primary fat in this egg, as is the case with pork, as is the case with lard of all things, is monounsaturated fat. So again, when we're told to avoid some things that we think of, the fatty meats for example, it says at the top here, avoid fatty meats. A pork chop is predominantly protein, it has 0 carbohydrate, it has more protein in it than fat, and the fat is predominantly monounsaturated. So we really need to sort out our carbs from our fats and our monounsaturated fats from our saturated fats, and as far as I'm concerned, the form in which they're delivered by nature is the form in which they should be eaten. Now just a final little statistic which I hope will amuse you. Did you know that olive oil, we talk about the Mediterranean diet as the saviour of all people on the planet, and we talk about the olive oil that's found in that diet, what a wonderful thing it is. Olive oil actually contains 6 times the saturated fat level of a pork chop, which also has the fat still on. That's how mad the current advice is that we're being given. And just to leave you with one other thought, fish, which we're so often told is the source of all polyunsaturated fat, a tuna steak is typically 25% saturated, 25% monounsaturated, 25% polyunsaturated, and 25% essential fatty acids. I don't know how many different ways I can explain it, but nature will deliver real fat in the form that we should be eating it. And when our governments are talking about saturated fat, 9 times out of 10, they're talking about processed carbohydrates, and that is wrong. There's an advert in the UK at the moment which is irresponsible in the extreme, and it ends with the Food Standards Agency saying, when it comes to food, we're the standard. Well, I'm sorry, Food Standards Agency, but when it comes to food, nature is the standard. Thanks for listening.